Glad you could come this evening. Please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8 as we continue our study in the book of 1 Corinthians. Paul is continuing his concern with problems that the church in Corinth had. And in particular, in chapters 8 through 10, he's discussing meat offered to idols and applications to matters of liberty. And I believe this is one of the questions that they had written to him about. He's answering the question. We're going to see in chapter 9 that he discusses some related issues that he wanted to discuss. They deal with it, probably not what they ask about, but things he thought that were related that needed to be discussed. So we'll talk about that. We get in chapter 8 this evening, though, first of all. Chapter 8 is discussing eating meat in an idol's temple, meat offered to the idol, and whether or not that can be eaten just for nourishment. Later on in chapter 10, he's going to come back to the subject and discuss eating meat offered to idols, eating it under other circumstances, but right now we're talking about eating it in the idol's temple. And he's teaching us that if you really truly understand there's only one God, then you can, if you have a mature knowledge, you can understand that you can eat that meat as just meat. Not to worship the idol, it's just food. But the problem is that he's discussing is, while not everybody understands that, to them, especially if they grew up worshiping the idols and eating meat was an act of worship, to them that's what that is. And they can't eat the meat without worshiping the idol, or at least thinking that it's what they're doing and that God would be displeased with them if they did it. And so he's teaching us that concern we should have for our brother, that it's not just a matter of what we can technically prove to be right, but whether it's having a harmful effect on other Christians, especially those who are weak. So let's go ahead and review the verses 11 through 13 as we conclude chapter 8 tonight and then get into chapter 9. Questions or comments before we begin this evening? All right, let's read verses 11 through 13 of chapter 8. I'd like to read chapter 8, verses 11 through 13 for us, please. Chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. I'd like to read that for us, please. Frank, please.
And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble.
All right. So we've discussed at good length in our previous discussions the problem. Verse 11, what consequence could come upon the weak brother, according to verse 11? What consequence could come to him if, because of the influence of the one who eats the meat? Bill?
He can perish.
He might perish. So we're talking about consequences that have eternal significance to it. That it's, in other words, we'll see in verse 12, it's a sin. But your influence, if you eat this meat in the idol's temple, and he is led to either eat it because he thinks he wants to worship the idol because of your influence, or he doesn't thinking it's a sin, but he does it because of your influence anyway, then he sins. And the result is he's going to perish. Unless, of course, he repents. But the point is that's the effect that what you have done would have on him. Okay? Verse 12, what effect does it have on you? If you do this to a brother, you eat the meat in the idol's temple, and you cause him to stumble, what effect does it have on you? Verse 12. How does it affect you, Darian?
You sin against Christ.
You sin against Christ and against the brother. Okay? Wounding their weak conscience. So, because you led that person to sin, now you have sinned against them and against Christ. Now, why is it a sin against Christ? We can see why we sin against the brother, because you led him to sin. Why would that be a sin against Christ? Susie?
Because you didn't love your brother enough to give up your liberty.
All right, you don't love the brother like you should have, Frank.
Because Christ died for him.
Okay. Christ died to save that brother, and now you're causing the brother to be lost. You're working against Christ. What he died to accomplish, you're working against it and causing the one that he died to save to be lost instead. So you see the consequence. Even, he says, because of your knowledge, verse 11. You think you know so much, and maybe your knowledge is right, but you don't think about your brother like you should. Now he's in sin, and you're in sin, even though technically what you did may not have been sinful of itself. But the influence of it has made it sin. Okay? Other comments or discussion through verse 12. So what's the conclusion then, verse 13? What does Paul conclude then, verse 13? Bill?
He said, if the food makes his brother stumble, he'll never eat meat again.
Okay, don't eat the meat. Don't eat the food. Now again, we realize that we're talking about the meeting in the idol's temple. He's going to discuss other circumstances, and I've tried to emphasize that repeatedly. We're not done yet. We won't be done until the end of chapter 10. And then we can discuss various applications and so on, but the thing to understand is that there are circumstances when you simply should not do what you know is not wrong to do. But you shouldn't do it because of the harm it can do to a brother. Okay? So that's a summary then, I think, of chapter 8. I don't know if we need to spend any more time on it, unless somebody has another further question. We'll obviously come back to it in chapter 10. Other comments or discussion on chapter 8 before we move to chapter 9. All right, let's go into chapter 9 then, and we will come back, as I said, to the eating of meats. But we're going to discuss other matters of liberty in chapter 9. So here's the overview that I brought to you last time. Chapter 8 discusses eating meat in the idol's temple. Chapter 9, the first part, is going to discuss financial support of preachers, and we'll see how that relates to matters of liberty. And then later in the last part of the chapter talks about self-control and the danger of falling into sin, and that also relates, it's still on the topic, but he's discussing related topics. And then chapter 10, he comes back to idolatry and the eating of meats offered to idols. So let's look at the first part of chapter 9 then. It talks about the financial support of preachers. So let's read chapter 9, verse 1 through, well, it really goes to verse 14, well, further at least, but let's read 1 through 10. Let's read 1 through 10. I'd like to read chapter 9, verses 1 through 10 for us, please. Chapter 9, verse 1 through 10. I'd like to read that for us, please. Steve, please.
Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, who tends a flock and does not drink the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of this hope.
Okay. Now, as I said, we're not really through with the discussion specifically on supporting preachers until we get to verse 14 at least, and then maybe after that he'll discuss the matter of liberty aspect of it. But he starts off talking about the fact he's an apostle. And so question number 1, I ask you, how does this fit the overall theme? Why would he discuss his work as an apostle in the context of this discussion of eating meats offered to idols and matters of liberty? How does it fit, Steve?
Paul's self-sacrifice and the relinquishment of personal rights for the sake of the gospel.
Okay. He's still talking about foregoing your liberties. It's a different aspect of it, but he's showing that there are ways in which he has had matters of liberty that he has been willing to surrender for the good of the gospel. And so he's going to make application to that more specifically as we get further down in the reading. But other comments on it. Other comments on how it relates to the context. Daryl.
I think you and Steve have pretty much said it, but if I can be just a little more precise, I think that Paul is doing this to help, this is an argument to support his argument in chapter 8. Some of the people reading chapter 8 might say, I don't want to give up my stake, whatever. And Paul is using this as an example where he'd given up something. He'd given up the support he could have insisted on. He could have argued, it's right for you to support me, you should support me, but he gave up that right for the sake of the interests of others. And I think he's using that as an example and an argument to convince those in Corinth to give up meat if it's going to hurt their brother.
Okay. And I would add to it also, maybe I can't really prove this, but Paul often in his letters kind of interrupts himself. He's talking about one topic, kind of interrupts himself to talk about some related topic, and then comes back to the topic he was on to begin with. I suspect, and I probably can't prove this, but I suspect that the question that they asked him, the question about eating meats offered to idols, and he's using this as an opportunity not just to show that he has made sacrifices himself, but also to discuss an area that he knows needs to be discussed. He's bringing it in because we're going to see, especially in 2 Corinthians, that there were people in the church in Corinth who were questioning his apostleship and questioning the way he was receiving financial support. So it seems to me that he's anticipating that discussion and bringing it in related to this discussion because he sees a connection there. But he'll come back to the eating of meats offered to idols when we get to the end of chapter 10. So he's talking about the fact he's an apostle and he's free and so on. Okay, other comments on how it fits the context. Okay, now he has some questions in verse 1. What are the questions that he has in verse 1, and what's the point? Question number 2. Steve.
He's asserting his authority and legitimacy as an apostle.
Okay, he's affirming that he's an apostle. He has freedoms, he has freedoms as an apostle, and he says he's seen Jesus. And then we'll talk about them being his work in the Lord. What is the significance of the fact that he's seen Jesus? Steve?
He had a direct encounter with him.
Okay. Frank?
That it's also one of the requirements for an apostle to have been a witness of Jesus Christ, to see him and see him after his resurrection.
Okay. So he's affirming that he is fully an apostle. Again, some are doubting that, some are questioning it, but he's fully an apostle. He saw Jesus, and he, yet, despite this position that he has, which any earthly man would have a position of the highest in of the church, yet he's still willing to submit his liberties. Okay? What is the significance of the fact that he says, "Are you not my work in the Lord?" Well, I'm looking at the thought question, because it goes into verse 2. They're the seal of his apostleship. It's question number 2 and the thought question. Why does he bring up the fact that they are his work and the seal of his apostleship? What's the significance of that? Susie?
Well, he had been chosen by God to be a messenger or a chosen vessel to preach to the Gentiles. And here he's saying, "You're my work. You're Gentiles. You're my work."
Okay.
And he'll say that can't think of the term, fathered the congregation, started the congregation.
Okay. Rick, did you have a further comment?
Well, over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 12, it says, truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you, with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. So he showed them all. He had the power of an apostle. He had his apostleship from God.
Okay. Other comments? Sharon?
It's probably a little bit of a rebuke as well. Why would they, of all people, be questioning his apostleship when they are the evidence of his apostleship?
Okay. So if there's anybody who ought to know that Paul is an apostle, it ought to be these people. The congregation existed because of his preaching and teaching. They had accepted his teaching when he came there. They saw his miracles. He worked as a sign of his apostleship. We're going to see in chapters 12 to 14, they had power of miracles among them. Where'd they get that? The only way they could get it is by an apostle laying hands on them. Who would that be? Paul, of course. So they knew his miracles. They knew the miracles they had, that he'd given them the ability to do that from God. So they obeyed the gospel message that he presented. If anybody could recognize that he was an apostle, it should have been them. So that's what he says. Then, you're my work in the Lord. You're the seal of my apostleship. If anybody has any questions about it, certainly you shouldn't have, because of the evidence you've seen. Other comments or discussion through verse 2. All right, so again, it seems to me like he's anticipating the fact that he knows that there's some there that have these questions. He's going to bring up his liberty, but he's bringing it up in a way that shows that also that he is an apostle and reminds them that they should be accepting his teaching and his authority as an apostle. And then in verse 3, he begins to defend himself specifically in things that he'd given up as matters of liberty. Okay, questions, comments through verse 3. All right, so verse 4, then, he begins to discuss some of the things he'd given up, the rights he had that he says he'd given up, verses 4 and 5. So what are some of the rights he said he has, beginning in verse 4, in verse 4 and 5? What rights does he have? Verse 4 and 5. Karen.
Well, he says they have the right to eat and drink, to take along a believing wife.
Okay. To eat and drink in verse 4, and to have a believing wife, as the other apostles and so on do, okay? So here are some things that he had the right to do. He'd already said he would give up eating meats, even though he had the right to do it, if it was appropriate to help people be saved. He's also not married. Here's another matter of liberty that he's not enforcing in his own life, even though some of the other apostles did so. Okay? So again, he's showing that it seems to me, question number 4, that's the connection to chapter 8, is he's talking about matters of liberty. In his case, that he'd given up. Okay? Question, comment? What liberty does he have, and what does he refer to in verse 6 then? Continuing the discussion, question number 6. What other right did he have that he had, that he brings up? Terry.
The right to be supported in his work.
Say it again.
The right to be supported in his work.
Okay. The way he says it is the right to refrain from working. That is, or at least that's the New King James. That is not that he's not going to work at all, but that we would say he's not going to have a secular job. But as Terry said, that the church would support him. He would have the right to let the church support him financially, which is what he's going to discuss then through the next few verses, and then say that he didn't exercise that right when he was in Corinth. He did not expect them to support him, even though he could have. And again, it seems to me that there's someone who would question him about that. So we're going to deal with that. But first of all, he's going to establish the fact that preachers have the right to be supported. Then he's going to discuss his own liberty in regard to it. Okay, other comments through verse 6 as he discusses the things he had the right to do, the liberty to do. Okay, Now he's going to defend the fact that preachers can be supported, and he uses a number of illustrations to illustrate the point. Question number 7, verse 7. What examples does he use in verse 7 to illustrate the support that he's talking about? Verse 7. Steve.
Soldiers, they're supported by the government.
All right? So he talked about soldiers. Where am I now? All right. He's establishing the principle, the laborer is worthy of his hire. Here's his examples. The first one is the example of a soldier. What does he say about a soldier? Steve's already basically said it. What does he tell us about a soldier? Frank?
A soldier or warrior doesn't go into battle at his own expense. He's paid for his labor, for his work in that.
Okay. All right, so a soldier is supported by the country that he's defending. Okay? He's doing a work on behalf of the country. The country should support him for doing that. Okay? Everybody understands that principle. Okay, here's a second example is what? Verse 7. Rick.
A vineyard owner that plants his own vineyard, does he not eat of it first?
Okay, so a man who operates a vineyard is going to eat the fruit. He's going to receive some benefit from the work that he did. He does the work, he receives benefit because of the work he did. The labor is worthy of his hire. Then what? The next example. Terry.
The shepherd who has sheep or goats and drinks some of the milk that they produce.
All right, shepherd. He receives benefit from the flock, milk or wool or whatever. So all these examples, and he's going to give us some more. He illustrates that when you do a job, you have a right to expect to be supported financially for the work that you do. He's going to apply that to the preachers, the work that they do, and they have the right to be supported. And then he's going to explain why he didn't use it. Questions or comments through verse 7? All right, now I made a mistake. I want to back up. I skipped question 5 and I shouldn't have done it. Back to verse 5. He talks about having a believing wife. Talks about he would have the right to do it, like the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. Cephas is Peter, of course. I ask you, there's some questions that don't relate directly to the subject of matters of liberty, but follow importantly, I think, from what he says. What do we learn from this about the doctrine of celibacy? What does this teach us about the doctrine of celibacy? Frank.
These verses refute that doctrine, that it's necessary for any servant in the church to be required to be celibate.
Okay. So the idea of celibacy is that certain church leaders must not marry. They're forbidden to marry. But it's not just the Catholic Church that teaches that. There are other religious groups that teach it as well. But Paul is clearly saying that he had the right to do that. Even though he wasn't married, he had the right to marry. And specifically, he says other apostles, in particular Peter, they were married. Okay? So the Catholic Church says they must not be married. The Bible says they were married. Okay? What is the significance of the fact that Peter in particular was married? How does that relate to the doctrine of the Catholic Church? Sharon?
The Catholic Church says Peter was the first pope, and it also says popes shouldn't marry, but not only are they wrong about Peter being the first pope, he was married, so they're not being consistent.
Okay, so right. So they're wrong that Peter was the first pope, but they're also wrong about the idea that church leaders must not marry. Peter, who they say was the first pope, was married. Now, the interesting thing is, they acknowledge that. It's not, they can't deny it, it's too obvious. In fact, in my Catholic Bible, there's a footnote on verse 5 here that says Well, let me read it to you, if I can find it here for you. Well, again, let me find it. Well, anyway, basically what it says is that the early church leaders had the right to marry. They acknowledged that. They changed the doctrine later on. They acknowledged that in the New Testament, the church leaders could marry, but the Catholic Church changed the doctrine later on. They admitted that that's what happened. So it's interesting to me that they admit. How can you deny it? It's right there. So Peter was married, and the other apostles many of them were married, as well as the brothers of the Lord. Okay. Other comments on the significance of that as regards the Catholic teaching. I'll ask you one other question. How does this have to do with the idea of Karen?
This 1 Timothy 4:3 specifically says that the doctrine of forbidding to marry is a false doctrine and part of a departure and falling away.
Okay, so we know that the idea is forbidding to marry is clearly said to be false teaching. Now, you don't hear much about that from the Catholic Church, but they admit at least that it was permitted in the first century. What about the idea of Mary as a perpetual virgin? That's part of question number 5. How does verse 5 relate to the idea of Mary as a perpetual virgin? Rick?
Well, did not Jesus have a brother?
Okay, in fact, yes, it says that those who he listed as being married were the apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. So here he not only mentions that they were married, but that Jesus had brothers. Well, if Jesus had brothers, then how could Mary have been a perpetual virgin? See, they teach that after she was a virgin until Jesus was born, which is true, but then they say she continued to be a virgin from then on, that she never had sexual relationships with Joseph. But here we find that Jesus had brothers, therefore she was not perpetually virgin, so they're wrong about that as well. So here's a verse that brings out a lot of points that are a problem for Catholicism. All right, questions or comments? I should have brought that up in verse 5 earlier, but questions or comments before we move back to verse 8. All right, back to verse 8 then. I'm sorry for the losing my pace there. Here's another example, another illustration. He's saying, he's not just talking as a man, but there's an illustration from the law he can use as well. And what illustration is that in verse 9? Question number 8. What does the law say that relates to this matter of supporting those who work? Susie?
You weren't to muzzle an ox while it was treading, so that it could eat while it was working.
Okay. So he says, don't muzzle an ox while it does its work. Well, what's the significance of that? Muzzling the ox would do what? Steve?
If God cares about the well-being of animals, how much more would he be concerned about the well-being of people?
Okay. So Paul explains it. Is he talking about, did God write this because he's so concerned about oxen? Of course he's concerned about oxen, but there's a much more significant lesson for us in it. That the same thing that's true of the oxen is true of us, that someone who does work should be paid for it. But back to the point about the muzzling of the ox, what does muzzling the ox have to do with it? Muzzling the ox as it treads the grain refers to what? Susie?
It prevents it from eating.
Okay. So, which we're not that familiar with personally, no doubt, but when they would take the grain and they would spread it out on a threshing floor and they'd have the oxen walk on it to separate the kernel from the chaff. And then they would throw it up in the air and winnow it, and the wind would blow the chaff away and just have the kernels of grain left. But here's an ox walking on that, doing that work. If you muzzle him, he's looking at that grain and he's down there and he's hungry and he's working away and you're not letting him eat. You're not rewarding him for his work. The law said you can't do that. You can't muzzle him because otherwise, if you do, he's not rewarded for his. So he's illustrating the point: the labor is worthy of his hire. Even an oxen, an animal, should be allowed to be rewarded for his work. Now again, back to Steve's point, much more so then that would apply to us, and so Last part of verse 9, is it for oxen that God is concerned? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? Well, no, he says it for our sake. The lesson is, he that plows should plow in hope. He that threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. So now we're talking about a farmer. Just like the oxen should be allowed to benefit from the work it does, the farmer should benefit from the work he does. So another illustration then of the principle of the laborer's worthy of his hire. Now all these illustrations are there to illustrate a point that he's going to state directly in the following verses as applies to preachers. He hasn't said much about preachers as such, but he's going to make the application of these examples now to supporting preachers. Questions, comments, discussion through verse 10. Sharon.
I think verses 9 and 10 teach us something about how we study the Bible. Sometimes people will say that you can only apply a principle to the context that it's given in, and the context is important, but like they'll say 2 Timothy 3, talks about withdrawing from people. Well, then you can only withdraw from people who are lazy because that's the context of that verse. Or they'll read 1 Corinthians 14 about spiritual gifts and say, well, we don't have spiritual gifts, so there's nothing in that chapter that applies to us today. But here's this almost random law: you should not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. And God says what they were actually supposed to get from that was this general principle about supporting any animal or human who's working. They deserve to get whatever they need in order to keep working and to be provided for.
We're going to discuss that a lot, as Sharon mentioned in 1 Corinthians 14, when we get to chapter 14. But we do it, many times we do it without even necessarily thinking through what we're doing. But we read a passage of Scripture, and it's applied in a particular situation. And yet it's not just applied to that situation. It's a principle that applies to lots of other situations. Now, you have to be careful with that. But we're doing that right here, chapter 8, and we're going to do it some more before we're through. Chapter 8 is the principle of don't cause your brother to stumble. Don't exercise a liberty in a way that causes a brother to sin. Well, that's just not about meats offered to idols. We don't have much problem with meats offered to idols, but that principle is going to have all kinds of applications in lots of other areas. Okay? It's the same thing happens in lots of other things, and as we mentioned 1 Corinthians 14, we're going to see lots of examples of principles that apply not just to spiritual gifts, but to other situations as well. Lots of places where we do it. You have to be careful with it. Don't assume that we can do that without making sure that we're doing it properly. But that's a good point. And there's other points we can make as well. Other comments, though, before we move on in verse 10. Okay. Well, there's another lesson I think we can learn from this as well, of applying biblical principles, and that is that teaching and learning from Scripture, from Bible examples. This passage, the context is talking about example. Some people say we can only follow Bible commands. Bible examples are not meant to or required to be followed. Well, that's his whole discussion here, is example after example used to teach Bible principles that we need to learn from those examples, specifically from the example of the apostles, apostolic examples, and so on. So we do learn from Bible examples and ought to apply them properly. But again, we have to be careful how you do it, but do it right. But Bible examples do teach principles that we need to apply. Anything else to verse 10? Okay. Well, before we close, quickly, question number 9. What are some other passages that talk about supported preachers? Somebody give me another passage that talks about supported preachers. Steve.
In 1 Timothy chapter 5, 17 and 18. That the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. And the Scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages."
All right, so there's the very principles we're talking about applied to supporting elders and to supporting those who teach the gospel. Okay? Other passages that talk about supporting preachers. Other scriptures? Question 10 out of 9. Susie?
Well, in 1 Timothy 3:15, we're told that the church is the pillar and the ground of truth. So that's from the study of authority, it's a direct statement of what the church is supposed to do, to be the foundation and the support to spread the gospel. So that's part of the work, and the work has to be done. So then you can go on, but then we have examples of how Paul and other apostles were supported by congregations. So
Okay, so there you have it. General principle. Churches support the truth. One way they support the truth is by supporting gospel preachers. Bill?
Deuteronomy 25:4, it says that you should not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain.
That's the original passage that Paul quotes about not muzzling the ox. It's Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. The other scriptures about supporting preachers. Okay, there are at least 2 or 3 others we need to discuss, so let's save that for next time then. We'll take our break and come back next time. We'll start again with question number 9, other passages about supporting preachers, and then we'll discuss his conclusions and applications as we get down to chapter 9. Thank you.